What if I said, why are all white people friends with racists? I'll wait. Do you know how horrendous it is to think that all white people are racist? Feminism shouldn't be compared to racism. That's how I know that you've never heard of intersectional feminism. And you think that asking me why are all white people friends with racists, this gotcha moment. It's not a gotcha moment. It's actually a conversation we can have. I don't shy away from these conversations. Why are majority of people, if not all people, friends with people who are racist, regardless of their race? Because people of color can be racist to their own race and people from other races. And that is because majority of people have not deconstructed colonization and patriarchy and racism. It's why you can see one person of color voting to deport immigrants from Mexico, even though they themselves are immigrants. People think of racism and sexism as two very diametric things that have nothing to do with one another, but they actually have a lot to do with one another because they're both power structures and they're used to reinforce patriarchy, right? So when colonizers came to North America, specifically the Canada region, Indigenous populations had matriarchal societies, not exclusively, but they existed. And when white people landed on North America, they refused to speak to the women that were in charge. They required to speak to a man. And that was the start of patriarchy in North America that we know today. John A. Macdonald, which was the first Prime Minister of Canada, was quoted saying that he did not want to give the rights to Indigenous people because it would take away from the rights of white men. That power structure has continued to present day. It just switches targets. During COVID, you saw it switch to Asian population. Now you see it switching to Mexican population. And if you notice, they actually have a really hard time differentiating between Indigenous people in North America and specifically in the United States and Mexican people, because Mexican people are the Indigenous people of Mexico, that area, right? You slap a border down and say now you're in the United States. That doesn't mean that the Indigenous people, who were mostly nomadic, not exclusively, it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to tell them apart just because a border got placed. So that power structure of racism that was created to keep white people above any other minority group was also excluding women. White men could own property. White men could have bank accounts. White men could have credit. And credit was created as a way to exclude people of color from being able to own things after they were allowed to have jobs. And a lot of men specifically like to look at the power structure, and specifically people of color that are men like to look at the power structure of racism, and they can acknowledge that because they personally will feel it. But when it comes to sexism, when it comes to patriarchy enforcing misogyny, men don't want to acknowledge that portion, because then if the playing field was considered equal between men and women, patriarchy benefits men regardless of their race. They may not be as high up in the social hierarchy or regulations in regards to ownership. They might not be as high up as white men, but they're higher than women, which means that women, specifically women of color, are at the intersection of not only being discriminated against because of their gender, but also because of their race. So if you have a black woman or an Indigenous woman, she is going to be marginalized more than a white woman. A white woman is going to be marginalized because she's white, but a black woman or an Indigenous woman is not only going to be marginalized because of their gender, but also because of their race. And racism persists because no one wants to dismantle those systems, because they somehow feel they benefit from it, except for the ones at the very bottom, which also includes different gender identities and also includes disabled people. That's why when it comes to discriminatory legislation, it highly targets gender identities, it targets disabled people, and it targets women and minorities to continue to establish the power that is white men. And that's largely why, even if you ever listen to black women, they will say specifically that they feel more safe in a room with a white man than they do with a white woman, because white women are the men of women, or the white men of women. They largely will enact those power structures against women of color because they're white. That's where we hear white women tears. A white woman can be discriminating, can be horrible towards a person of color, specifically a woman of color, and when she calls that out, the white woman will crumble and start crying hysterically and try and make herself seem like the victim in the situation, because they can't handle any scrutiny of what they are doing. And they, to some degree, subconsciously understand that by crying and weeping and making the black woman seem like the angry black woman, it makes them get leeway in that situation because they're enacting a power structure, which is racism. By them crying, they try to make themselves seem like the victim, and therefore the black woman will get blamed for being the stereotypical troped angry black woman. And these power structures are put in place everywhere. They're in workplaces because they're in our legislation. Specifically in Canada, we have something called the Indian Act. So I might appear white presenting, but I'm Indigenous. So under the Indian Act, it doesn't matter that I don't look Indigenous to you. I personally, the legislation that's enforced on Indigenous people is different than the legislation that's enforced on white Canadians, right? An Italian Canadian doesn't have to go and get a card and specify their blood quantum in order to justify themselves calling themselves an Italian Canadian, right? We just couple up all these white people into they're Canadians. But the reality is they're immigrants. And that is baked into racism. It's saying everyone else is others. You can see it all over social media right now, specifically with Canada talking about immigrants from India. They'll say that we don't need any more immigrants, there's too many immigrants here, and they never consider themselves part of the category of an immigrant, even though they are in fact immigrants. Their parents immigrated here. They are not originally from North America. That is racism. That is a power structure being enacted upon people of different skin tones, saying you are the other because we are the white that lives here. And you yourself are a very good example of someone who doesn't want to look at these power structures because in some way they benefit you. Those power structures benefit me. I'm white presenting. So when I go out in the world, people treat me like a white person. Generally, people are not almost ever following me in a store, assuming that I'm going to be stealing like they would someone who looks Indigenous presenting. And that is because of racism. So the same way that I would say majority of people are friends with people who have racist beliefs, that's because most people have not deconstructed. I would say majority of people haven't deconstructed. Even people in their own groups of people haven't deconstructed, because that is baked into absolutely everything you consume, all of the legislation that controls your life, the media, the movies, the same way that misogyny is. There's something called the Bechdel test where you watch a movie and try and find two women who have conversations that have anything to do with anything outside of men. Majority of the time when you watch a movie and women are interacting with one another, they are almost solely talking about a man. Men are centered in absolutely almost all forms of media. And if women are centered, it's to degrade them.